Welcome, everybody. Those of you who are on board so far, thank you for joining me tonight.
Good to be here.
Good to be here.
Thank you so much.
Excellent.
Excellent.
For me to be on this show, Pastor Mike.
It's a delight to have you, Bishop. Thank you so much for joining in the conversation. And we're hoping that it will be illuminating. We're hoping that we'll be able to be as open and as frank as possible, because I think that's really where truth is unpacked, is when we can be connected to each other by virtue of our hearts, that we can be open enough with our mouths without being offended. I think we're all on one definite page. I know we're all on. That's definitely the same page, and that's that we all believe Jesus Christ is Lord. Can I get an amen? Can we have
Amen. Amen, Pastor.
You can even get an hallelujah from me.
Well, I'm grateful for that, and we're so grateful for you all being here. Just waiting for my team to tell me what's happening with Reverend David, because I don't want to begin without having everybody on board. I think that he's in the back office there, waiting to come on. Just checking what my team's saying. Great. Yes, it's great having you guys on today. And in the midst of all of the strange things we're seeing happening around, I don't know about you, but 2020 feels like so far an entire movie from the horrific, diabolical disease of COVID caused by this coronavirus, right the way through to the other disease and virus we're seeing manifesting in more prominent way again in the recent week or so with racism and the whole issue of racial justice, etc. We are in a movie, guys, and it's only June. I'm wondering what the other half of the year. You know, this is very, very concerning. And I know that, you know, of course, all of you come with your own particular theological acumen. You all come with your own human opinion, and you all come with your own experiences. And we want to share all of those tonight, so that we can get to feed into each other, feed off of each other, and have frank and open, organic conversation that gives some insight. And some of the conversation might be uncomfortable. And I think that's the problem, that people aren't prepared to have uncomfortable conversations in order to be able to move forward. And I think it's necessary for us to do that tonight. Let me open by asking each of you to give like a 30 to 60 second introduction of who you are, what you do, and then we'll move forward, and hopefully that will give enough time for Pastor David, Reverend David, I should say, to join us. I don't know what's happened to his system. You know, we're in technological times right now where we're reliant on internet power and all the rest of it. So let's give him a chance to come on. But I'll let the Bishop go first. Thank you, Bishop.
Thank you, Pastor Mike. I'm Bishop of Southwark. My name is Christopher. I became Bishop nearly 10 years ago. I was already in the diocese as Bishop of Woolwich. And the Diocese of Southwark, south of the River Thames, that's our northern boundary, about getting on for 3 million people, an amazingly diverse community. So beyond our anger, which people will need to express this evening, I have had a simple message that God's creation is black and white. It is multicolored. It is something which is God's gift and blessing. Our diversity is God's gift and blessing. And equally, I feel that black suffering is also the suffering of Christ. And it's very important that that is held together, that it's the Christ who suffers when any of us suffers.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bishop. Selena, please, you go ahead.
Thanks, Pastor Mike. I'm Selena Stone. I am a Brummie, but I work in London as a...
We can hear that. We can hear the drum.
I haven't been to London for a while now, so it's coming fast. But yeah, I teach political theology at St. Mellitus, which is an Anglican theological college. So lots of our students are training to be priests in the Church of England, but we have lots of people from different churches who are doing a degree in theology out of interest, or because they're youth ministers or ministering in other denominations. Right. So my interest in the area where I teach is theology in relation to public issues, politics, social justice. I teach a module on theology of power for a master's course.
Right.
And so really interrogating these issues about, you know, what is the reality of human experience and how does theology speak into that?
Right.
So really interested in the kind of themes that have been coming through recently in the issues around racism. This is really my playground, so glad to be able to offer some of that today.
Well, you're most welcome, Selena. Thank you so much. And without patronizing you, I think you're the youngest member of the conversation,
Yes.
the conversation of friends today. So you bring an extra special, unique. Thank you so much for your presence. And of course, we're going to go to Pastor Steve Tibbet. Now, Steve, I have to say something. So I keep having to look at you thinking, is that really Steve? Because the last time we saw each other was January. Now you've got this Papa Smurf beard. This lockdown beard, dude.
It's my lockdown beard. Yeah, sorry about that, Pastor Mike. Yeah, it's. I don't think it's going to last though. The feedback I'm getting is that it may have to go. But
at least you're allowed. My wife won't let me grow. I've said I want to become part of the beard gang, and she won't let me grow one. So
yeah, I think that's where most of my feedback's coming back, and Deb probably will win the discussion, I suspect.
So tell us about yourself, Steve, and your background and your context at the moment.
Well, Pastor Mike, first, thank you ever so much for reaching out to me and inviting me into the conversation. I seriously see it as a huge privilege just to be drawn in. And I know we've connected over the years on and off as we're both kind of based in Lewisham. So it's great to join you. And I know a lot of my church have been listening into this dialogue that's been going on that you've been hosting for a number of weeks now. And so when you contacted me, I thought, wow, gosh, I can't say no to that. And but I just want to say up front, I mean, I've really come to learn tonight and listen. I come as a pastor. I find myself in a situation where, you know, I'm a white, pretty old guy with white hair, and but I pastor a Black majority church, and my church is very diverse in age and culture. It is a third white, a third Black African, many different nationalities or nations represented there, and also a third Caribbean. And so diversity, I've been leading the church 25 years. It's been a massive learning and journey. I'm very grateful for many people in my church that really have walked this, and I've learned a lot through their stories.
Right.
And so that's my context. That's who I am, and so it's great to be here.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for coming on, and we appreciate your contribution, especially based on what you've just described as a white leader leading which was a white majority church, and it's now a Black majority church. So thank you, because I think your contribution will be interesting and worth exploring. Absolutely. And we've got Reverend David Chisanya. He's on board. We're all just introducing ourselves just to let the viewers and those who are auditing this particular conversation understand who my friends, some of you old, some of you new, are. So Dave, could you just introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi, evening. Thanks, Pastor Mike, for coming on, allowing me to come on board, and hi to everyone else. My name is David Chisanya. I've served across London, leading a number of churches in terms of having some pastoral supervision over a number of churches over the years. Over the last couple of years, I've been involved in a lot of work around church consultancy, leadership development, both within the church and outside, secular organizations, corporate organizations, statutory agencies. Been involved in working at SMT level, senior management team, EMT, the executive management team, and working with CEOs and boards of health organizations across the UK. And I have a fairly rigorous itinerant ministry. I've had the privilege of preaching across a number of denominations and a number of networks and in a number of spaces, and served for a few years as one of the board members, or at least one of the council members at the Evangelical Alliance. I've had quite a bit of experience, and I've been in a position where I've been a senior Black leader in a white-led organization. So I think I've got some fairly interesting perspectives to offer. to the narrative.
Absolutely. And many people might not know as well that you're the co-founder of the Street Pastors as well. So there's a great background there as well. So we celebrate you all. Thank you once again to everybody for coming on. I opened, Dave, before you arrived by saying, I know that we can start off on the same foot. We may disagree on many things by the end of this, but it's time for a healthy, open, transparent, frank conversation. And the title of tonight, of course, is talking about really race, justice, and religion in the 21st century. And we have the truth in black and white. And the black and white, of course, is a nod to the fact that right here on the virtual table that we're sitting around, so to speak, there are black and white leaders. And we want to discuss the truth in an open way. And I said there's one thing that I know we start off on, and that's that we all believe that Jesus Christ is Lord of all of us, no matter what our skin color is or our background is. So we celebrate that. I want to open tonight by talking, first of all, about some controversial things. I mean, let's talk about what people are talking about. And right now, especially in London, emanating out of this horrific, diabolical situation that we all saw on that video clip of Mr. Floyd, George Floyd, having his life taken from him in the most dehumanizing way. Just horrific, traumatic to watch. And traumatic for a couple of reasons, at least for me. Number one, because it was a human being. Number one, of course, having his life taken. But number two, because you just felt helpless. You're watching this clip on video and can't do anything about it. Hearing him cry out for his mother as a grown man, and his mother who's also deceased. That again adds to the layer of trauma. And then seeing a abuse of power from a white police officer, simply looking like it was an everyday thing that he was doing, staring into these multiple cameras, phone cameras of people telling him to get off. All of that was just traumatic. And the trauma maybe scratched at a scab that we, as I would include myself, of course, as I'm sure at least David and Selena would, as African diaspora people, in terms of what it represented, how emblematic it was of the suffering, whether it be micro or macro, that diaspora people experience daily. And of course, it was, again, it's caused an eruption of responses around the globe, and in particular in countries where we are African and Afro-Caribbean minority groups feeling that particular pain. And what's interesting here, and the controversy that's really erupted, and I want to jump straight to the real controversy that seems to be in the big conversation at the moment, is the silence. The silence from places where you would expect people to have been vocal, and vocal a lot sooner also, especially from areas where we talk about white-led black majority churches. There's one of the, if not the largest black majority church now, white-led, which I think most people believe is Hillsong. And there was, I'll call the name because it's quite open and quite frankly out there, that of course there was a big backlash from what seemed to be a tenuous response to it from their senior leadership. And many of the black members, and I'm just speaking about what's being spoken about here. This isn't particularly trying to incite anything. It's already out there. So we're just having open, frank conversation about how really probably what was considered inappropriate, the response. And then I know since then the message has been taken down, and they've done another response to try and bring an apology to what took place. But it really opens up the context of where we should be hearing things from. We haven't. And what we have heard finally has only come in recent days in terms of the response from especially our white brothers and sisters who lead black majority context. And I guess really probably, I guess the best representation here for that is probably you, Steve. So I'd ask you, you're a pastor of a large, we both pastored, I guess, what people would consider large churches in a black area, people would consider. When you consider the demographics of Lewisham, how we per capita in Lewisham Borough have probably a higher number of African and Afro-Caribbean people than any other borough per capita. And leading a large black majority church where people have intentionally decided to place themselves under white leadership, which is great, under your leadership. And I know you've brought that church, as I said, from being a white majority church right the way through to a black majority church. And interestingly, many of our conversations, I know you were talking the other day when we had that conversation about the fact that it was a couple of your black pastors who were saying to you, know what, Steve, you should say something. You need to speak out about this. And that's a wonderful thing. Why do you think there has been silence? I know I looked at your website. Your website is phenomenal, by the way, Steve. King's website. Big up to your technical team. I was looking at your website, and I know it sounds like you're 3/4 majority black, as you said, a quarter are white. And you were talking about the fact that it's a wonderful, diverse community. And you must have people around you then who are able to feed into your knowledge. I looked at your website, and your leadership team on the website is 13 people. You've got 3 of them who are black out of the 13. So you've got people around you who can feed into the context of giving you greater understanding. Why do you think it's taken so long for many other white leaders to speak up about this? Is it fear? Is it detachment from understanding the black experience? Give us your opinion on that.
Well, Pastor Mike, I'll do my best. I think first, I was on leave last week.
Right.
And I think what happens is that leaders tend to, at critical moments, sometimes freeze because they're worried about saying, particularly, I think white leaders especially, they're worried about being ill-informed and actually doing more harm than good. And I think I want to first think the best of all pastors, and they made mistakes. I made a mistake. I was on holiday, and though we addressed it on the Sunday, the feedback from my congregation was, we want to hear what you have to say, Steve. You're the pastor. And I was kind of but I've got a number of black pastors on my team and governance body, but they help me. And that's why I think gathering people that, in a sense, walking the journey on a day-to-day basis, having them shaping you and helping you is hugely important. And I was just, to be honest, along with others, I was a bit slow off the block, and I've apologized for that. I should have known better. I can come up with an excuse, but that's the reality. But that once I got it, which we had a call on Sunday evening, I think moving fast, and we were dealing with all pre-recorded and all that, we would address it on normal on a Sunday, I suspect, if we were in our buildings. But that all said, I was up early Monday morning and recorded something that I think you've seen, where I tried to just express my heart that I think this is massive, and what's happening in America does echo into the UK. There are multiple stories we could use from the UK where people, whether it be the police or people in positions of power, are causing ongoing racism. And of course, it echoes into people's lives, their own life experience. So what happens in the States, they see something, they go, yeah, I was pulled over by the police numerous times. And so it really is connected. And I think the other thing I found White Fragility a challenging book to read, but I thought it was important to read. It's a secular book, I'm sure you've all read it. But and it says that what happens is the white community, I think this is the same of all of the white community and particularly white pastors, is when people raise the issue of racism, they too quickly take it personally and get defensive and say that you're accusing me to be racist. Well, you may be, of course, but I think you have to, I've tried to anyway, learn and listen and to not take the feedback. I mean, I'm getting a lot of texts, emails at the moment from my church about this, helpfully. And I tried first to listen and then to understand that there are real structural issues at stake. And the importance of the white community that are privileged, that we have privileged legacy most of the time. The black community have other issues related to legacy, slavery, colonialism. All these things are big, deep narratives, generation, and the white community think that's in the past. No, it isn't. It's still happening. And I have the privilege of going to Africa from time to time, and the British Empire. We got a lot to answer for. But And that's a whole other subject in itself. But so I think it's really important for people like me and others that hold positions of leadership in churches, whether they be black majority or white majority, to speak for any injustice. And what happens to the black community sometimes on a daily, weekly basis it's outrageous. It needs to be called out. And then within our sphere of influence, sometimes I'm asked, what are you going to do, Steve? And I'm nervous to overpromise that, actually, because my influence is really quite small. But within this influence I have, I will endeavour to speak up for any of the minority groups or those that don't have the platform. And I spoke to one of a guy in my church today, and he was laughing with me. He said, who would have thought that he said to me, this is what a white privileged pastor who grew up in Bedford would be speaking, because I realize I haven't had the same narrative and journey as many of my people in my church. So I feel it's a huge privilege and responsibility. And that's why I said up front, I've come as a learner this evening. I'm listening to the other intros. I'm thinking I'm not as well read. I'm just
me and you both, mate. Me and you both. Don't worry.
Yeah. So I think comments. I hope that helps. I'm very happy to hear, take questions or whatever, however you want to go, Pastor Mike.
Yeah. No problem, man. Well, I mean, critically, from what as I said, one of the things we want to talk about is what's being talked about. And you mentioned the word privilege, Steve, and I think to everybody in the group chat tonight, this issue of privilege is an interesting one, because a lot of people were saying that even the comeback, the apology, being able to have 3 of your black employees come on and speak in your defense, which is what happened in the case of the Hillsong situation. Many of them, there was posts going around and people going around talking about how that is in and of itself privilege. And so it's an interesting context. David, speak to us. Tell us what your thoughts are concerning the same context.
Yeah, couple of things. I think first and foremost, we talk about black majority. I think we need to draw some nuances.
Yeah,
there's often black majority in terms of people, but it's not black majority in terms of power. There's often a disproportionality in terms of where power lies. So in a network that I worked with and in many churches that I come across, what you have is a large number of African, Caribbean, non-white members. You have that reflected in very small percentages within the leadership team. And even within that realm, they're often not senior executive positions where there's a lot of power invested in the individual. They have a title, but they need the ratification of somebody else in order to make a decision. So I think we need to look at that. There's a difference between, and I'm just talking generally about how many, black majority in terms of the number of people, but less so in terms of the power that people exercise. And let me just say something else as well, and I think which is important. And it's that often in those spaces, there is an inverted triangle. And often you find that the black majority members in white-led churches are disproportionately more qualified, theologically and biblically literate, spiritually acute than their white contemporaries, but they don't have the same opportunities to exercise their ministerial gifts within that space. And there's a reason for that. Because there are 3 assumptions. Steve talked about white fragility. There are 3 assumptions that inform white fragility. The first one is the assumption of superiority. There's a generic assumption that comes from pseudoscience, that comes from the transatlantic slave trade, that says it's enculturated. I often say to white people, say to me, am I racist? I say, well, you don't go swimming and remain dry. If you get socialized in a culture that is intrinsically racist, then actually you internalize that unconsciously. So there is something about the assumptions that are made about those black people. So I'll give you an example. You'll say in a meeting, you'll say we need to have representation on a board. Yeah. And you might say, well, there's 3 or 4 interesting people that I know. And someone will say, well, are they qualified?
Yeah.
but you just ask for an accountant. I'm not going to give you a bricklayer. You ask for an accountant. So I'm obviously racking my mind to say there's 3 accountants that I know. Let me get, but there's a correlation between blackness and inadequacy. And that's the next assumption, the assumption of inadequacy. Inadequacy is interesting because inadequacy says you couldn't possibly be.
Yeah.
And that is what runs often in that collective consciousness of white privilege. And then the third assumption that runs is not just superiority and inadequacy, is the assumption of incompetency. And incompetency says, even though you're qualified, I doubt your qualifications.
Right.
And it's not just about on a micro level, it's on a macro level. You come as a doctor to this country, you have to retake your exams in order to demonstrate that you're up to standard. And yet many of those institutions are institutions that have had some input from the UK. So I think there's a problem. And let me just say, because I don't want to talk too much at this point, there's a difference between, you see, when white people speak, it's called a narrative. When black people speak, it's called a noise. And that seems to me to be what the problem was at Hillsong. And I'm not trying to assassinate anybody.
Yeah.
Oh, it's not. That's not.
Well, it's definitely not. We're just talking about. We are talking about what's being talked about.
Yeah.
And that's
and what people have said to me, and it's this. You see, if this was a white person, I think it's a fair assumption that white leaders would talk to other white leaders before they made a statement about it.
Yeah.
But it's one has to ask, why would you possibly make a statement about a black issue without talking to your black people to help you nuance and construct the narrative so that it's relatable and not offensive? And that in itself is the kind of assumption of inadequacy, incompetency, and superiority that I'm talking about. And let me say this, the fact that you can bring 3 of your black employees in to ratify your position is not just about privilege, it's about the abuse of power.
Wow.
Because those black employees are paid by the organization. And often you cannot critique the organization, you can't bite the hand that feeds you. And I'm not saying it's intentional, I'm saying actually, when we really start having honest conversations with ourselves, we have to talk about the way in which the subtlety of white privilege and white power works to coerce and co-opt black people to create a narrative that validates the very thing we're trying to critique and deconstruct.
Wow. As a millennial, Selena, as a millennial academic, tell us your perspective, because I think, as I said before, and I didn't want to patronize you, but I think this is critical. Your generation is known as the protest generation. When you look at the late response, as I said, the late response of many white, because that is a hot topic now, especially amongst your generation. Tell us what's really going on in the heart of your generation as they see that response, and why so many people on Twitter, on Instagram, were reacting that way to the statement in and of itself.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of am hesitant to speak for my whole generation, but I'll offer my reflections, and I'm sure some people may agree, some others might not.
Let me tell you something, your perspective is going to be better than my perspective on your generation.
I mean, I think that for lots of black people in white-led churches, there's a sense of there's no excuse to not know what's happening for black people, particularly in an age of information. Like, if you're a leader of a white majority church, then you have a responsibility to do your due diligence around how your congregation experience the world. So for me, one of the major things is the failure of pastoral care. That if you are responsible for being the shepherd of a congregation and you're not building the kind of relationships and creating the kind of culture where your congregation who are black are able to share with you the reality of their experience, and something's gone wrong in that leadership relationship. Whether it's that the black people in the congregation are self-filtering, so they're not giving you the fullness of what they're feeling for whatever reason, and maybe there's mistrust there, maybe there's assumptions about how you're going to respond. But also there's an issue of what work are these leaders doing to understand the reality of the lives of the congregation they're leading. Because I mean, I find it difficult, even if you're following your church members on Twitter, or you're on your Facebook friends, or you're watching the news, there should be a response. And to me, even the question of talking to black people, for me, I felt, why would you need to ask somebody? Like, as a human being watching that video, you must have something to say as a Christian leader. You must have, even if you can say, I have no words.
Yeah.
I'm hurting. Even if you say, I have no words, I'm in pain, I'm with you. Like, you don't have to have some deep theological, articulate thing to say, but I don't think saying nothing is an option.
Yeah.
Because I think silence says something about where your priorities are. And this is something that struck me quite severely, being in a lot of Anglican circles, is how many bishops were speaking so boldly about Dominic Cummings in the press, on Twitter, tweeting freely about everything going on, doing it, and not just bishops in the Church of England, but pastors around the world in the different parts of the church, making long Insta videos about Dominic Cummings. How dare he travel? This is a breach of, our moral order, that someone can just do what they want, and yet a black man, and any man, whatever color, can be killed by a policeman, and just nothing can be said. I'm thinking, how can you be more outraged about a man driving to Durham than a man killing another human being in the streets? So it's a question of compassion. It's a question of I question the capacity for pastoral care that needs to spend a lot of time thinking and rethinking about what to say. You have to say something.
Yeah, thank you so much, Selena. Bishop, I want you to speak in just before you speak into this, because you mentioned something to me when we were having a conversation earlier about, and which intrigued me because it's a unique perspective in the way you articulated your context when it comes to allowing people to experience their pain as well. So I'm going to ask you to speak into that. But to all of our viewers, I want you to share. Everybody, all of you who are online right now, if you're being blessed by what you're hearing already or enjoying the conversation, I need everybody just to hit your share button. Let all of your sphere of influence know that this conversation's happening. It's already a healthy conversation because it's open, frank, and yet it's covering lots of ground already. So I'm going to ask Bishop. Go ahead, Bishop. Please speak.
I want to begin by saying that, and thank you, Pastor Mike, again, that what has been said so far, I want to begin by echoing. I echo what Steve has been saying. I might be a bishop, but I am here like Steve to listen and to learn, and I have very much to learn. I was very moved by David, who's a very good, long-standing friend, of articulating the reality from a black perspective of white power and privilege, which I realize that in many respects I symbolize. And I also very much echo from Selena what it means to be a shepherd, because I begin by thinking of bishop. I am the chief pastor in my diocese. I have to be a shepherd. The reason I carry a shepherd's crook is because Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. And that is the key to this. So when my black clergy, one of my most recently ordained clergy who came with me last year to the Holy Land with 30 other newly ordained clergy, said to me that, like others, he is hurting so much now, but also he wants me to realize that he identifies strongly with the rage and the anger that many of his community feel. And that speaks to me because it cuts through me as well. And going back to Christ's suffering, Christ said on the cross, I thirst. And I actually think those words, I can't breathe, are very Christ-like. I thirst, I cannot breathe. Breath, we're in the season of Pentecost, is the meaning of spirit, the breath of God, breathing life into the world, breathing life into what he has created, breathing life into us. The breath of life is the power at the center of everything. That is ultimate power. Abuse of power is a terrible distortion of it. But breath is ultimately power. When someone is disempowered by being unable to breathe, that cuts through everything. Just before the lockdown, I'd gone with a Roman Catholic bishop and others and 70 pilgrims to the Holy Land. And we got to Jerusalem 2 days before the West Bank and Bethlehem were locked down. And I thought, gosh, a very strong reaction here. There's no evidence of that happening in Britain. And when I got back, within days, we had our own lockdown. We are part of a global interdependent community. the one thing the pandemic has made very clear is that our lives are interdependent. We've got very preoccupied with nationalism, particularly around Brexit in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, even longer back. But the pandemic reminds us that we are globally part of one family. So what happens in Minneapolis, Minnesota, is going to have a reaction here in London. I've identified throughout my ministry with those people who have tried to challenge injustice. But the Archbishop of Canterbury says that when we talk about injustice, we all have to take the mote out of our own eyes first. It is very easy to preach about injustice, but we are all to some degree perpetrators of injustice in our own areas where we have power and responsibility. But this particular area of injustice, racial injustice, is the reason why I'm with you this evening.
Thank you so much, Bishop. Great points there. I want to step, while we're talking about the whole white black thing in the context of religion, or in terms of really Christianity and our faith. I'm a black man, and as a black man, proud black man, as they say, I'm quite a big black man. As if you was to see me live, I've probably got bigger over the years since I got black. But the fact is that I'm used to feeling the sense of difference in terms of not just my physical size, not just my skin color, feeling difference and feeling like sometimes even some of my very, very good white friends would never really be able to understand some of the things I've tried to articulate to them that I personally have experienced in terms of being treated differently. For no other reason. I'd like to think I'm, reasonably educated. I'd like to think that I'm reasonably able to articulate myself, but yet my visuals immediately cause sometimes difficulty. And I want to connect that in terms of the word identity. The fact is, one of the questions, again, that's being talked about, and I really want to talk about what's being talked about just for the first part of this conversation, is whether or not, especially still connected to the statement or the late statement that came out from that particular church and many other churches that took their time. Even yourself, Steve, thank you so much for your honesty. One thing that's just asked for by many black people is honesty. The fact that you were honest enough to say that you were late and you should have jumped on this a lot sooner. And I definitely appreciate that honesty. But something I'm going to stick with you, Steve, only because we got a relationship. So I know you won't take this personally. But just you talked about learning. Bishop talked about learning as white leaders. And one of the conversations that's happening, one of the things that's being spoken about as a result of what took place with that same, as what's being described as a tenuous response from one of the largest white-led black majority churches, is whether white leaders can really identify with black members. Because the black experience is a very unique experience. Yet in your church, Steve, you're 3/4 black. In Hillsong and many other churches, that's the new phenomenon now. Of course, we all know the history about how our African and Afro-Caribbean in particular Windrush generation came here. They wanted to attend churches. They got rejected by the white church, white established churches. And so that forced them into having to establish their own churches. And this is where we get what has been named the Black Majority Church. By the way, just for anybody auditing this who's not aware, I keep getting this question asked of me all the time by especially my white friends in Christianity, saying, why do you call yourselves black churches? And I have to always remind them, it wasn't us that ascribed that. That was ascribed to us by the white church, that we are Black Majority churches. But the fact is that what you have happening is that you've got, in your case, Steve, 3/4 black. I took the time to get one of my assistants to get some information together. And in the midst of when we're looking at even your leadership on your website, the visuals of it, you've got 13 in your leadership, yet only 3 of those leaders are black visually. I know you probably got more, but on the visuals, immediately that was mentioned by my assistant who said, oh, hold on, there's only three of us represented. How can we move forward if there's a disconnect between a white context being able to identify with what black people experience, even just by virtue of just something like that, a simple visual, a 3/4 black church, but on the visual, when you look at it, only 3 are in the leadership team on the visuals. Talk to us about how we can learn some more about that. Bishop, do you want to go first, and then I'll come to Steve?
I think representation, numbers, but not tokenism, are the key to this. And when I became bishop, I thought that we had to start with the things that were creating for the future a proportionate representation. So, but if you start with the sowing of the seeds with commitment and integrity, it takes time before you see the harvest. And I do think one has to work at this purposefully, step by step, and move forward.
Thank you so much, Bishop. Steve, go ahead, mate.
Yeah, well, I tend to agree with you, Pastor Mike, and I read George Yancey's book, One Body, One Spirit, that for me as a leader, I found really helpful, that said that having a diverse leadership, I think was the chapter, is critical to actually really empowering and understanding the people you're pastoring and called to lead. And so, we're on a journey. I've worked hard. It takes time. It takes, in my experience, to be totally honest with you, transitioning your staff team and raising people up. It takes time. I think if you were to look at our governance, our board, and our eldership, that we've done a bit better there, but we've still got a way to go. So I say to my church, we're on a journey, and we haven't arrived, but we've made progress. We've made huge progress. So if we were having this conversation 2 years ago, we would have been further. You would be giving me stats that are even worse. If you went back even further, we'd be looking really bad. And I don't think I've come on to sort of say in any ways Kings myself is like a leading example. I've wanted to engage in the moment, in the pain that I know is going on. And I'm open with my church about the challenges it brings. And I suspect, I do say to them regularly, hey, you come to my church, you're very welcome, but I'm a white guy. I literally sort of say, right, you do know I'm a white guy, and I have certain worldview that's shaped by that. I try and identify, but I also recognize that if I overstate that, then I'm not being genuine. They know that. I mean, let me put it this way: my boys grew up. They experienced a minority experience in a black majority school. So they got quite an interesting mix. And I used to say to them, hey, look, this is good experience for you, because that's a lot how the black community experienced whole of life, not just a few years at the local comp. But I also know that my eldest son has never been pulled over by the police, that I'm aware of anyway. But his best mate has, I don't know, we lost count. So I can identify to a point, Pastor Mike, but I am my journey, and we found the power of stories very important in helping both the white community not get defensive, but actually to connect and build genuine friendship. And that's when I talk about, when I talk about narrative, I want to hear both, because a lot of the white community are just, when they first start out, particularly grow up in a provincial context, not an urban context, they're people blind. They're naive at best, if I'm thinking good. And I think this is where there's huge opportunity for my church, both for both, all parts of it. And I mean, we are 2/3. I know you keep quoting stats, but I said earlier about a third. And even when I say a third Caribbean and a third black and a third white, that's a kind of sometimes an unhelpful summary of the reality, because there's many mixed marriages. And one of the reasons that people gravitate to a church like mine is around the issue of identity, particularly second generation identity, where I understand in part that the black community is asking that question, who am I? And that's why we would point them ultimately to Christ. That's what we would teach. We would say, look, we're working hard in ensuring that the power structures represent one man, you in Christ. But actually, our identity comes from being in Christ first. And I'm not trying to sort of like theologicalize the thing out of reality, but I am saying that we all come to this as Christians, and that we need identity there first. But I suppose I'm trying to agree with you that identity is a massive issue for lots of people, but particularly in my experience, listening to those in my church that are non-white.
Yeah, appreciate that, Steve. And thank you so much for your honesty. Go ahead, Selena. I was going to come to you, Selena, next.
Okay. Sorry.
You're in the spirit, Selena. Go on. Tell us about your journey as well, Selena, because I think the issue of identity and conversations that we've had before, I've always been intrigued by your journey. So talk to us a little bit. Go ahead.
I mean, I grew up in a Black Pentecostal church in Birmingham, moved to London, went to a large, mainly white Anglican church for a while, left because of lots of the issues we're talking about today, and I've kind of wandered around to various places and moved back to Birmingham, and now we're in lockdown, so it's kind of like problem solved. I think I want to reflect a little bit, and I don't know your church, Steve, so this isn't directed at you directly, but I really want to, I guess, pick up on this theme of how difficult it is to raise Black leaders, because I hear this narrative a lot where I am. There's a kind of, Black leaders lack confidence and all this kind of stuff. Now,
you're hearing that mainly from a white context, you're saying? Yeah. Okay.
So particularly in the Church of England, there's lots of attempts to increase diversity of leaders. Yeah. Some of the narratives are, there's a lack of confidence with Black leaders. Yeah. We really struggle to identify them. Again, Bishop Christopher, I don't know you like that, so I'm not quoting you at all. But I've grown up seeing Black leaders in my church and across at conventions, Black women leading, Black men leading, Black families. So for me, this idea that leadership is something that's foreign to us, I find very problematic. What I think is often what I've noticed is that white majority churches and churches with white leaders don't interrogate the whiteness of their churches or their organizations. So they assume that the space is neutral, that anybody who comes in can just make their way through with no problems. They don't realize that they have a culture, and their culture has shaped everything about the way they do church. From the music to the preaching style to the worldviews to the ways that fellowship is done and social activities, everything about it is shaped by whiteness and white experiences, and often middle-class white experiences. So if you're a Black person joining that church, you have to conform to a certain standard in order to belong there, just to go in on a Sunday and sit there, because you're used to a certain kind of preaching, singing, style of everything. And you're basically having to give up on all of those cultural preferences in order to belong to the congregation. And that's already enough. So the idea of kind of moving through into leadership, it's only really possible if you're willing to really conform even more. If you're willing to do all the work possible for these white leaders to see you as one of them, in order for you to be raised and elevated up. And I've seen in a lot of these white spaces, having a white spouse helps that a lot. If you're a single Black woman, that's probably not going to happen. If you're a Black couple, that can always also be tricky. But I know we talked about this before, David, about how a white spouse gives you a kind of softened edge in a white majority context because people think you're a safe Black person. So I think there were certain patterns where power isn't shared in a way that's really fair in these spaces. And I think white leaders and white majority contexts really have to do the work to understand what is the culture of this place, how is whiteness shaping this, and kind of inadvertently forcing Black people or convincing them that they need to self-filter in order to belong there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Selena. That's very helpful. Bishop and then David.
Well, I follow on from what Selena says. So one of the things that has been a real help in the last 5 to 7 years has been something called unconscious bias training. Yeah. And I think that really does lift the scales from eyes. And it is, I think, part of a privileged majority culture that you can say, I'm not a racist, but you can be completely unconscious of the way your reactions are formed by a much lower level of prejudice, generalization. So I think unconscious bias training has been really helpful, and I'm extending that at the moment. I think also, following on from what Steve was saying, that the importance of story, because story gets people away from sweeping generalizations. And a lot of those generalizations are very misleading, very harmful, and need very, very careful analysis. But the story has a power of its own.
Yes. Phenomenal. Thank you. David, I want you to speak into it, and I want to juxtapose it as I come to you, because Dave, I know you've worked in a white majority context as an employee, as a manager, whether we call that regional pastor, whatever it might be. But the fact is, you've worked in that context. You're a black man. You're going to be really understanding of this. And I know your size, mate. I know you're a big black guy. I described myself as a big black guy earlier. And what did you say?
Smaller than I used to be.
No, I've got to see you after lockdown to see if you're really cool. It's been the biscuits or the sausages or whatever, you know. But the fact is that I know you'll have a unique perspective on this as well. I mean, you know, in the white majority spaces, like we talked about the Hillsong, we talked about Kings, and we're thankful for Steve being here, where black people have an abundance of black people have chosen to really, in choosing to be under white leadership, they're choosing not to be under black leadership. And I guess, therefore, then there's a trust to believe that this leader will be able to identify with you. How have you managed that, especially in managing white pastors?
Oh, we haven't got enough time for this. Let me just make a few perfunctory comments about what I've heard. I want to say something about what they call in theology signification, the coding of language. I've worked cross-culturally in London, community engagement stuff, and if you're a Bengali woman or a Nigerian woman, you've been in England for 25 or 30 years, and you don't understand the language, it offers, it's quite reasonable for somebody, or I've heard it argued, that it's reasonable for someone to critique you. So if someone's been there for 30 years, they should have some degree of mastery around language. I'm not saying they should speak the Queen's English, but there should be some degree of mastery. And I want to overlap that really with this whole notion about learning, the significance, the linguistic significance of the construct of learning.
Yeah.
Because we've been here for a long time. And what I want to say is that white leaders have not learned to speak our language. So they're quite guilty of the very thing that they and white society critiques, or some do, but white society generically critiques people who have migrated here and say, if you don't speak our language, go back to where you're coming from. And so because I've been in it so deeply, this notion about language to me is a signifier for I'm not racist. And I want to learn. Well, the question is, how long do we learn? And I believe in the power of story. My thoughts are going to be, I'm going to truncate them. I believe in the power of story. But slavery is referred to as a gaping wound. And one friend of mine said, actually, she's sick and tired of bleeding in public. And it seems like no matter how deep our story goes, it doesn't transform white fragility. It's almost like a circus show, where we tell our story so often that actually it can be recited on our behalf if we're not present, but it's not transformative, because I'm not racist, I'm learning narrative is an intrinsic part of white fragility and white psychology. Now, if we're going to talk about real transformation, and we talked about the incarnation earlier, then actually the incarnation is not just about proximity, it's about the removal of power and privilege. So Christ laid aside his majesty and made himself of no reputation. And that's fundamentally important. If there's going to be a real understanding of what is going on for black communities, then there's going to have to be a purposeful laying aside of white privilege and white fragility. That's not our responsibility to ask a white person to lay aside their fragility through the telling of our story, because that's regurgitating trauma. Now, we don't have to regurgitate trauma so that someone else can feel well. So when they feel better, then we feel traumatized again. That's lunacy. So we have to have some serious conversations. I don't tell my story anymore because my story's been heard and people know the story. And let me link this to George Floyd and Amy Cooper very quickly. Sorry. for this time. Is this?
No, take your time. Go ahead.
What you got with Amy Cooper is an unconscious and unintentional betrayal of white fragility. She would have said at work, "Can you teach me? I want to learn." But when she got into the park and she saw this big black fella who gave her an instruction, and she thought it was audacious of him to exercise any civil power in relation to her whiteness within that space that she considers a white space, she suddenly moves from ignorance to mastery in the marshalling of political nuance and language in order to get this guy into a state of mind. If he wasn't so present and wasn't so powerful in his mind, he would have suffered from a form of trauma and a form of anxiety. She unveiled what is often unveiled in whiteness, which is a comprehensive and a fundamental understanding of the politics of race. But the denial to embrace that, because it requires a journey of laying aside all the privilege and power. And actually, if we moved away from whether white people are racist or not racist, to whether they are more racist or less racist, as Barbara Trepanian says in a book called White Racism, and she says how well-meaning white people cause more problems than they should.
Wow.
If we moved away from the binary opposite of racist or not racist to less racist or more racist, we might begin to go on the journey. Because then we start from a position of having to already own one's prejudice and one's racism as a result of cultural conditioning. And that then gives people permission to journey forward. So as a man, I have to talk to Selena and other female friends. And I start with the assumption that I'm sexist. I have patriarchal and misogynistic tendencies by virtue of the privilege of who I am as a black man. So I don't say I'm anti-sexist or I'm not sexist. No, I say actually I'm more sexist than I would like to be. That then gives Selena and other women an opportunity to engage in a dialogue that becomes mutually transformative, rather than to place on, for example, Selena or any other woman, the responsibility of unveiling my own misogyny and my own patriarchy that I'm acutely aware of, but because of the privilege, I refuse to divest myself of it. Let's get down to the root of the matter, and we have to move away from superficial categories of language so that we don't actually deal with the real issues.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Steve. Give a response, Steve. I know we've kept you on long tonight. I promised you. Thank you for trusting me, number one, and being bold enough to come on and be honest, because I know you're always going to be honest. Give a response to what David said, and I'd like you also to speak into the context of structural racism as well, because I know you've grown that church, as we said, from being a white majority church to becoming a black majority church. I'm tempted. I know we've had many conversations before. The first time we ever met, I was giving you that lift down from up in London, and we drove back down. And I want you to talk about, where did the white people go?
I don't think the white people went. I mean, obviously, people move on from my church all the time, and they're free to do that, of course. So I don't think the white people left on the whole. I think the black people joined. I think that, and everyone's welcome. And I totally agree with the comment. I can't remember who said it, so forgive me.
No problem.
That people have to. I will talk this through. I know that people are making they've got huge hurdles just to walk through the door, and that I say to my church, I'm a white pastor, and I really try to be inclusive and aware and understand and care for people. But I'm a white guy, and therefore I've got certain tendencies of a worldview and how I lead. And my history shapes me. So, I have a business background. So King's, has that sort of, at times people say, well, it's a great church, it's well organized or something like that. And I think that's a positive comment. But and so I think I just say to people, look, please come in with your eyes open. That there are, and I think it was the pioneers, the first black couples, Nigerians, Lawrence and Mary, who are still with us, who, when they came around our house, and it's all learning, I have, they made a far greater journey than I ever have done. But I don't, in that sense, I can't not be who I am either.
Sure.
So I just say this is who I am, and I'm trying to be inclusive. And I mean, I would also say, I mean, the leaders I have around me on my board and my eldership are high capacity, high qualified Black and white people and women. So, you know, they're just, so I haven't got a problem with, I've just got like really high capacity people. Because they're London, and you know, some of the kind of people. I mean, I grew up in Bedford, and the people I found in Lewisham were far more kind of like educated, further up the whatever tree you want to call it. And so I haven't got that problem on my. I've got very successful Black and white people in the decision-making circles, and so. I think we've done better with that in the last 5 years than we did the 5 years before that, and I hope we'll do better in the 5 years ahead. I think people have come, and there are certain aspects of white leadership that they like as well. If I was totally honest, that's what they say to us. We're not perfect, so not playing. Sure. Yeah, so, you know, I think that none of us are perfect, are we? I don't think any of us are trying to say that. I think I've come on at your invitation to sort of say, look, I do see the issues of race and ongoing racism and issues of power, and I want to, in a little way, you know, stand and try and be a bridge to and seriously learn. So some of the things David is saying, I'm thinking, wow, gosh, I need to read more, and he knows a lot more about this than I do. And so you're asking me to make a comment. I can tell you about my journey in the past at the church I lead. But as I say, this is not an area of my expertise, but it is. I'm trying to get better at it.
Well, I mean, absolutely, Steve, and that's why it's brilliant having you on. I know the circles that you're in. I know you're the go-to guy for a lot of the white leaders when it comes to knowing how to lead, run, build a multicultural church. You've written a book on it about, you know, how to do that, almost like a how-to guide. And I think, you know, that's why you being on here, being honest and open is fantastic. And that's why these conversations are so healthy, because we can be real, we can be open, we can be frank, and we can all learn. We all come to this table, me included, aware of our own shortcomings, our own failings, our own sin, and that we come to the table with grace. And that's why it's wonderful for us to have this conversation. I'm going to ask Selena to respond. Before Selena responds, I need everybody, make sure you've shared. If you're enjoying this conversation, by the way, I want to see at least 200 fire emojis. Okay? Let the friends of mine know that you're enjoying the conversation and you're glad that we're being open and honest and frank with each other, asking the difficult questions of each other without disliking each other. If this is blessing you, I need to see at least 200 fire emojis. Otherwise, I'm going to end it in 5 minutes. Okay. But Selena, will you respond, and then we'll hear from the bishop?
I mean, I don't think I have anything to add at this point, although I'm really pleased to hear what you said, Steve, about having leaders in your church in the decision-making circles who are Black, because I think some of the challenge can sometimes be what Layla Saad calls optical allyship, where there's lots of energy for Black people on Instagram or on Twitter or pictures on the front of posters for the church. But when you look at who's making all the decisions, it's all white people. And I remember having a conversation with somebody once about inclusion and diversity, and I was trying to explain to him that he needed to think about culture and how to decenter whiteness in his mixed church. And his response to me was, we just need to fix the optics. If we just get some more Black people on the stage, then, and he was convinced of this, so I let him try, and it's failed. And I'm kind of waiting for the day when he comes back and says, maybe you were right, Selena. But yeah, I think the challenge is, how do you help culture to evolve alongside the optics of a leadership team and representation? Because I think too often I've seen the emphasis has been on the optics, and then the culture only changes up to the level of comfort for the white power holders, which is often always lower than what the Black people really want. And they might not say that, actually, which is how it works. People can't say they're not comfortable. They can't always say that's not enough. But we just settle and accept it because we think that's all we're going to get.
Thank you, Selena. Bishop, please speak.
I just want to say that I think even talking can cause irritation, because people say, we keep on talking about this, we want action. And I actually think words and action, the word was made flesh, the word is a living force among us. There is a need for action now. When we hold the mirror up to ourselves, to our church communities, what we see is a very, very sharp reflection of some good things and some things that are quite scandalous that we continue to tolerate them.
Yes.
I think it's holding that mirror up that's the key, and then committing to action.
Great. Thank you so much, Bishop. Steve, I know we've kept you long. I've got another special guest coming on, and we're going to let you go, but I'd like you to have the last word just before you leave, your last word, as it were. And what I'd like you to do is to, speak, address or state what you'd say to other white leaders of Black majority contexts who in the midst of this have been late coming forward. What would you advise them in this moment? And I know you're probably going to say you have nothing to advise them about, but surely you have something to say, Steve.
I'm happy to respond to that, Mike. Maybe I could just tell one story before I do that, which show how, I just call this all the mistakes I've made as a pastor. So so the crossover service, watch night, yeah? So my culture is we have a meal with a few friends and sing some old lang syne thing, which you don't really know why we're doing it, but that's what I grew up doing in my household. And then someone, I think it would be Lawrence, wrote to me very graciously, Pastor, can we have a prayer meeting on New Year's Eve? And I'm thinking,
you're Black member.
What about members? And I'm thinking, that's the last thing I want to do. I'm busy. I've just done Christmas. I want time with my family and sing old lang syne, things like that. So the first year I just wrote back and said, no, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
Next, okay, Pastor, next year, can we do it? I said, no, we can't. Well, look, we got so many people in my home. Can we use the church hall? Oh, okay, And then, so they're praying in the hall. I'm in Greenwich watching the fireworks across London. It's foggy, you can hardly see them. And then I get an email the first week of January where it's full of, Pastor, you practice what you preach. You not only used to talk about being inclusive and changing how the church you run, but now you've allowed us to use the building. I was like undone.
Yeah.
Because I just thought undone.
Yeah.
And I walked into the leadership team at that point. This is years ago, and just said, look, our church is changing. We're excited people that are non-white are joining, but the church has got to change with it. And it's got to change. I'm using this as hopefully a bit of a fun example of a complete mistake I made early on. We could spend the whole evening talking about those if you'd like on another occasion, Pastor Mike. But but now
we'll be on you. You got more money than me, mate. So you're going to pay.
Okay, and I just now love it. Watch now. I just go. I speak most years. But last year we had one of our young Black pastors speaking. He was outstanding, great public gift. I love it. And it's a small example of a change of, it's not like a big power thing, but it's an example of how you can just have a worldview if you're white that's shaped by your journey. But if you've got a diverse community, part of learning is to sort of change and educate those that do hold power, which definitely at that time would have been the white community in my church. That no, this is totally appropriate, and we've got to adjust as well. And I think King's has done that in part. I do think, and I have said to white pastors, and I've been involved in calls throughout the day because this is such an important and live subject. I've called them out. I've just said you've got to speak, and to say nothing is worse than saying something and getting it wrong. And if you go in with your heart and your conscience good, then people, on my experience, tend to pick that up. They read you as a person, and if they've got a relationship with you, which if you're a pastor they should have, then if they know you and they know that you're endeavoring to be genuine and do the best you can, then in my experiences, Christians are good. They want the best, that they think best of you. But it's very important for white community to speak. I agree with the comment about people want action. And I just don't want to overpromise that. I just don't want to promise something that then I don't, but I want to take responsibility in my sphere of influence. So in my local church or in the network I'm involved in, I've been in conversations throughout the whole day saying, look, there's a mirror to us again. We've got to keep speaking. We've got to keep learning. We've got to keep changing things. So we've got to speak. So that's why I'm here tonight, because I know you, Pastor Mike. I think you do fabulous work, and it's a great church down the road from us. And I wanted to kind of step in and join the dialogue. And I've loved the evening. I've learned again. And I suspect I know a lot of my team and my church are probably watching on. Hi, Tony. I know Tony. He's from Rochester. He comes to Kings. I know him. So hi, Tone. I'm sure you'll give me some good feedback later. But we must speak. The white community must speak, and leaders must speak. Totally.
Steve, just before you go, I've had a couple of questions come in that they want asked before you disappear. One of them is asking, what can a white leader say to his white members within a black church about helping to alleviate systematic racism? What practical things do you think could be done?
Well, I think education is really important. And so it's interesting. I have someone who texted me last night because we were talking about this as our extended leadership group who works with JP Morgan. And his opening text was, thanks for educating me that I'm white privileged. That's the start. That's good. I think that's really good, because he doesn't start with, defensive, I'm not racist. And of course, racism is rooted in sin. And so in a degree, we all have it. And it's not just black-white. Sometimes it's black-black. And if you're in India, it's caste. And so it's rooted in sin. And therefore, to a degree, it's in all of us. But for someone that, is fairly successful, great guy, great family, he's aware of the legacy, the positive legacy of majority and education and finance and all these things that many of the white majority take for granted. Just think they don't feel they're privileged because they're comparing themselves to others. Okay, but I think we all are. That's what I've educated the white community to a degree at King's. And I trust that helps them in their sphere of influence, which for most of our people that come to our churches is not in church. It's actually in the community where we've got to be kingdom people. Yeah. And therefore say that, if you're a banker, a nurse, a teacher, a mum, whatever, within that, be Christian and be aware of this issue and make a positive contribution. I think it's very important for the white community and leaders to speak, because I feel the pressure we put on the black community, not only to tell their story time and time again, totally hear what David's saying there, while they're also processing the trauma, the layered trauma, puts them under kind of, is unfair, it's not fair. And when I hear white guys, I heard someone say recently that they didn't know what to say because they feel ashamed. I say, it's not about you, actually. I want to say, get over yourself and get in the trenches and talk about this and identify with, basically decades history, daily racism that many people still experience in the UK. And I hope at the Church at King's that those that are, or white have a greater understanding of the pain that many of our brothers and sisters experience.
Appreciate your comments, my brother. Thank you so much, and great having you on tonight. I know one of the challenges that I know a lot of white leaders face is when they do wake up, or if any of their black members do, stimulate their consciousness to realizing they should say something. And even if it comes late, it's oftentimes received as contrived as well. So they've got that back in their off their faces as well. So I understand that. Thank you so much for being on tonight, Steve. We'll catch up soon. We'll have a chat later on this week or something. Bless you.
Yeah, love, and great. It's great to meet the rest of you, and I'd love to talk more with you. So bless you all. And
thank you so much.
Thanks again, Pastor Mike.
Thank you so much. We're about to bring on a special guest, a very special guest, as we move through this topic, talking about race and religion and justice in the 21st century, the truth in black and white. And we're going to bring on right now Professor Anthony Reddy. And he is a director of the Faith Center over at Oxford University. He is an academic, he is a writer, and as we delve into this new topic, as we push the conversation forward, we want to ask the question about, number one, we want to talk about the power, still talking about the church, the power of the black space, because we talked about white-led black majority churches. Now let's talk also about black-led black majority churches, which is what the original black majority church was. And I'd like you, David, as we're getting ready to bring on Professor Reddy, Dave, I want you to talk about the power of the black space, the necessity of the black space. Then I'm going to go to the bishop. I'm going to ask the bishop to speak about what he's seen, the power, the necessity and the power of the black space juxtaposed to a white faith space. And we'll come back to Selena. So, David, you go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that the power of the black is one of the only spaces, if potentially outside of the home, if not the only space, where we can be authentically who we are. Right. It's a space that could be described as a space that reaffirms who we are. So when I talk about worship, for example, and because we're talking about black and white, for a typical white Christian, a worship space might be a social space where obviously they go and meet with God, but they offer a kind of controlled expression of worship. But for a black person that's had a week that's been where they've been significantly affected by microaggressions around racism in the workplace, where they're psychologically, emotionally battered, where they feel that their physical being, their bodies are not, literally their physical bodies are not recognized as human bodies. I remember working in a place and a lady kept saying to me, "Excuse me, guy." And I said, "My name's David." I said, "Excuse me, guy." And then someone pointed out the guy was a big gorilla. And she wasn't even conscious of it. Because of my size, she was just calling me guy. So my body was under attack. But when I come into the black space, all of a sudden there's a recalibration and a reaugmentation of my sense of identity in relation to other black people. It's one of the few spaces in the black church where not only does God recognize who I am and the value of my body that Christ died for, but the people around me. And it's a place where I can speak to people without using words. I can use my eyes. I can use a gesture. I can use a facial expression. The church is the only space in Western society that literally means that God becomes a refuge and a strength in that space. And so it's important because it allows us, I call it, we go through the week often in a toxic environment where who we are is being consistently challenged and our performance is being evaluated and evaluated against white norms. We get to church on a Sunday morning and it's a place where we breathe. It's like escaping from a house that's on fire.
Yes.
And you suddenly get into fresh air and you take a deep breath, but to go back in and get the baby that's in the house. And that's how I think I'm not saying it's the only function, but that's one of the functions for me, the importance of the black space, because it actually gives us the resources to actually reinforce the positive things that we know about ourselves, but constantly being chipped at as we go through the week, as we live life in a society that still wrestles with its racist disposition.
Thank you so much, David. We've got Professor Reddy's just joined us. Thank you so much, Professor Reddy of Oxford University. Just introduce yourself to the people, then I'm going to go for the bishop's comment, and then we'll come back to Selena and then to you. But just to let the people know who you are and what your context is, if they have not heard of you, I don't know why, but let's hear from you here real quickly for an introduction. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Anthony. So call me Anthony, not Professor. I'm only called by Professor by the people I don't like. So, so as I assume that I'm amongst friends, you can call me Anthony. So Anthony will do. Born and brought up in Bradford, West Yorkshire, still got a Yorkshire accent, although I've lived in Birmingham for 36 years now. Well, no, 37 years now. I work in Oxford. I direct the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture. And I'm also a professor, an extraordinary professor with the University of South Africa. So I also have a link with the University of South Africa in Pretoria, where I try to go there every year, but this year so far COVID-19 has kept me so UK bound, or else I would probably be traveling to Pretoria next month. I'm a Black liberation theologian. I have written a number of books, and I edit the only international journal of Black theology. And so all this conversation is sort of grist to my mill. It's the kind of stuff I reflect and write about and talk about and preach and teach. So so it's great to be here, and I've enjoyed the conversation as I've been sort of sat in the background listening to you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I should call you Anthony. I hope you like me. I shouldn't call you Professor, in case you don't like me. Bishop, would you just address, from the context that you're coming from, how you viewed the power of the Black space and what you've seen in experiencing pastoral leadership in your diocese, etc., in terms of how the Black space has helped people psychologically and emotionally and spiritually?
Yes. That place where people do not feel on the periphery, but can truly understand their own worth and dignity, and actually feel that there's a sense of mutual regard in it. That is the space where people will start to grow and respond and blossom and flourish. The Black space is one of those. There is also the challenge of our baptism, that we are called out of our spaces of security into that common identity into which we are baptized in Christ. So there is always a tension for us between the space where we are secure, know ourselves, can be our true selves, and that sense of our baptismal wholeness, in which we are the people God has created, called us and baptized us to be. So these things have to be held in tension. When I became diocesan bishop, I realized in the diocese that people were confident in their own space, but very insecure when they stepped outside it, and tended to immediately then be critical of people occupying another space. And so I've tried to play out this tension of have your space of security, but be willing to step outside it into that place where you might feel insecure, but do that in a way that reaches out and embraces others.
Thank you so much. I want to lead into that. Stay on that real quick. I want to talk about the fact that, if the Black space is so powerful, if the Black space is so necessary, and when we talk about the Black space, I know some people are uncomfortable with those really, what they really are is just definitions and terms we use to define particular sections and segments which are a reality in society. And I know some people talk about the fact that, heaven has no color, which is not actually accurate eschatologically. And we talk about we're all one in Christ Jesus. And yes, we are in terms of our value, but that doesn't destroy our individual identity. And somebody may have, my team's telling me somebody may have a tab open, or you've got something else because there's an echo coming back through. I don't know if it's you, Doctor, if you, Anthony, or if it's you, Bishop. If you've got a tab open, if you can close it so we can get rid of the echo, that'd be great. Don't close this tab though, that you've got this. But if the Black space is so powerful, do people in the white space, do Black people in a white space have the right or lose the right to be able to come when they don't get the response they expect from their white leaders? How can you be in a white controlled space and complain about the lack of vocality from your leadership, should you not just transition to a black space? And this again is what my foreparents did. This is where the black majority church came from, going into a white space, not feeling that they're represented, and so starting their own thing. Would you please speak to that first, Selena? Then I'll go to Anthony, then we'll come to David.
I mean, I kind of want to say a little bit about the black space and its power, and also to critique it a little bit, because I think that I grew up in a black space, in a black Pentecostal church, and I loved it, and I wouldn't change it for the world. But I also think I'd be lying if I said that the black space is a place of flourishing for all black people. I think about the experience that women have in black churches.
Yeah.
Where their vocation to leadership as women made in God's image 100% is denied, where they're called to lead and not allowed to because of particular readings of scripture. I think about friends I know who've had disabilities who were constantly brought to the front for prayer, and that's created a kind of trauma for them that's caused them to walk away from black churches.
Right.
I think about friends I have who are gay, who had preached from the pulpit that they're going to hell, rather than having a pastor who was able to walk them through that journey of sexuality and faith. So I think that there are groups of people for whom the black church has been extremely difficult. And for some of those people, the desire to be in white spaces had been to find a safer space where they might feel that their personhood in its entirety might be more accepted. So I think that's some of the issues for some people, that we feel like as black people, this is a beautiful space for us. For some groups, it has been more difficult. And I think for people who have loved black spaces and have found them to be entirely welcoming, I think many people are determined to stay, even though there have been challenges. I think generationally, for millennials particular, and I think we heard earlier on about some people liking elements of white leadership. And I think for some of us, if we've grown up in a particularly dominating hierarchical kind of black church, having the space to dialogue and discuss is something that might be new. I think in other contexts, simply having a service that's an hour and 15 minutes is a relief to you, a 3-hour service on a Sunday morning. So I think there were very kind of pragmatic things that make people feel as if they want to explore a white church experience. I think for me, I've experienced lots of white church, and I work in an organization that's white. And I love black spaces now. I'm determined to create them and to be part of them, because I realize that I need that connectedness to remain rooted to myself.
Sorry to interrupt you. Just to backtrack a bit. So your experience in the white context juxtaposed to your experience in the black context, are you saying that you found more benefit being in your black context, having experienced the white context?
I think I say different rather than more. Okay. So I think because I'm a very intellectual person, I find churches difficult sometimes in general, because I've probably done too much theology for my own good. So I'm kind of analysing the sermons down to a T, and kind of wanting more and more like of the kind of real critical reflection and thought.
Have you been to the tab, Selena? Have you been to the tab?
I have been a few times, actually.
Have you? Did we come up on par? Remember, I've got the delete button here.
This is power dynamics at play right now, everyone. And so I think that there's a kind of like, I like a nice to the point 10, 15 minute sermon. If you can say in 10 minutes, why take 45? Some of these kind of cultural traditions we have, when you're like a professional person, you do presentations, you get to the point, it can be hard to sit through a longer sermon or have a service that goes on for a long time. So there are certain cultural shifts that I think would make it black churches a little bit more manageable for younger people, millennials, and especially the generation after us whose attention span is like short. I think church can be difficult.
Yeah. What was the determining factor then that made you decide to, I guess I'll use just a frank phrase, jump over back to the black church? I
mean, I think I'm probably in a bit of a transition now, on my way back, because obviously we're all in lockdown now. But I think I'm on a Sunday morning, I'm distinctively looking for Black churches to watch online. Right. And I think it's partly, I think, just wanting to refresh myself with my own heritage and cultural expression, seeing people who look like me preaching, leading. I didn't know that was so significant for me until I didn't have it. And even growing up with that has been a beautiful thing as a young woman, to see women preach, to see women leaders who were exceptional in their own right. Those images are very powerful. So I think I've longed to have more of that again. So I think that's probably part of my motivation.
Yes, yes. And I guess as millennials, sorry to stick with you for a moment, but I'm very interested in your millennial perspective, especially. I guess as young black millennials, it probably seems that it's rare to find a progressive Black church, because most of the Black churches are still quite traditional in their, whether it's institutional organization or their doctrinal stances, as you identified earlier, as it relates to feminist or anti-feminist perspectives and patriarchal structures. So would that be something that has hindered the millennial generation as well in being able to be drawn to the church?
I mean, I think in terms of being drawn to, that feels like a whole nother conversation. In terms of staying with the Black church, I think that a lot of people, that's all they've ever known. So to be fair, a lot of the kind of more progressive edge of ethics and those kind of conversations, I think lots of people who've grown up in Black churches probably just accept those norms and are not really looking to challenge them. I think some people who have had personal experience of, experiences that have challenged the prevailing narrative of Black churches and conservative ethics and doctrinal things, I think that challenges people to open up, to reflect on, why do I believe this again? And what's the kind of logic of my theology? And, are there kind of gaping holes in my belief system that I've kind of not really paid attention to? And I think that can lead people to begin to think, like, should I believe this? But again, that capacity for like critical reflection and, intellectual engagement with faith is also something that's not always encouraged in Black churches. It's like the man of God says, you say amen, and that's the end of the sentence.
Yeah. And just on the point of, should a Black person who's in a white dominated space in terms of the hierarchical structure, the senior leadership, should they lose the right to critique, to criticize, if they've intentionally chosen to attend a white-led church or white space? And I'm still sticking just for the moment with that whole topic of the controversy that happened recently, and a lot of the young, because this is one of the things, again, we're talking about what's being talked about. One of the things that's coming out is that there's been complaints from a lot of the Black members at that particular church, and yet the answer to that was given by the Windrush generation. Well, if you're not liking or feeling accepted or feeling represented, why don't you go to a Black-led church? Do you think somebody should lose the right to say what they've got to say?
I would never say that, because I think there's all kind of reasons why people go to these white-led churches.
Right.
And sometimes people have to go on the journey of trying them out, having a watershed moment like this where they realize their white pastor has no idea what's happening in their lives, and then make a new decision at that point about what they want to do. And I know people who I've spoken to this week who are at that point of saying, I've tried this, I've stuck it out, this is the last straw. So I think that's happening already. Wow.
So there's an awakening, you'd say, that's happening amongst some of the millennials who are in those particular churches.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Stina. Great insights, and we greatly appreciate your contribution already. Anthony, please speak. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important that we put this into a historical context. So, of course, for many Black people who go to white majority churches, that's part of their heritage. So, for example, most people in the Caribbean are Anglicans and Catholics, and have been Anglicans and Catholics for the best part of almost 400 years. And therefore, if you come from those places, while some people did leave to go to newer majority Black-led Pentecostal churches, for some people, if you have come from several generations of a particular church that you have been baptized into, yes, for some, there's a choice to leave. There's also, I think, a choice for some to stay, but I'm not going to let people run me out of a church that's part of my heritage. And therefore, for some, there's that sense of staying in a church in order to try and make it more Christ-like, because that's part of your heritage. So, for example, in my own family, I'm Methodist partly by accident, because my my great-grandfather was the first former enslaved African who learned to read, bought a piece of land, and founded a Baptist church. So the oldest Baptist church in East Portland is Belcastle Baptist Church. Built on a hill, as all churches are in Jamaica, it's built on a hill, and the symbolism of walking up to the hill to go to the church is that you are walking up in order to go to heaven, supposedly. Right. That church was built around 1870.
Right.
That's my great-grandfather's church. So when my mother came to Britain, and she came and went to a Baptist church in Bradford, and at the end of it, the pastor said, "It's really nice to see you, Miss Walker. We hope you don't come back next week because we don't want colored people in this church." She left that church, but she went to another church. She didn't necessarily switch denominations because her rationale was, I come from a family that has years of investment in this particular denomination.
Right.
Okay. Now, that said, and David knows my story and knows I talk about my mum all the time. If I live to be 100, and despite my PhD and being a professor, I will never know as much about Christianity as she did. You know, I mean, this was a woman who knew the Bible forwards and backwards and inside out, and I can't match her. But that said, I think what we also have to deal with is this notion of internalized depression. And so my mum, as wonderful as she was, there are three things she really couldn't deal with. She couldn't deal with homosexuality, but that's not unusual. She couldn't deal with Rasta, hated Rastafarians. That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, sure.
But here's the third one. She really could not deal with people who went to what she would call clap hand church, i.e. meaning Pentecostals. That was her own internalized prejudice. So again, also, like, we have put this into a historical context. So when the missionaries and the colonial regimes created church in the Caribbean and Africa, there was always a hierarchy. So basically, if you were near the top of the social hierarchy, or alternative, you had real class consciousness in terms of wanting to rise up it, you inevitably became Anglicans. Anglicans had the best schools, they had the best education. If you want to get into civil service, you became an Anglican.
Yeah.
If you were kind of middle class and striving to be more respectful, then like you were kind of Methodist. This is kind of like Caribbean Africa.
Yeah.
If you were the poorest of the poor, then like you went to Pentecostal churches, or actually even below that, actually like you went to Puka church.
Yeah. Sure. Puckamania, I understand.
Exactly. So therefore, what we also have to factor in are issues of class.
Yeah.
In terms of how we think about churches. So when I was growing up,
yeah,
I had, and again, it's something I've had to work through. So I really appreciate David when he was talking about that sense of having to own his own sense of patriarchy and sexism, which I entirely understand as well, because I grew up as the eldest child.
Yeah.
Eldest favored child of 4 children. So, so I know in that growing up, I inherited some of my mum's prejudice. So therefore, part of my own class consciousness was, well, actually being a Methodist just meant that I was just a little bit better than the Pentecostals who all they can do, is to quote my mum, all they can do actually is clap pan and sing. Like that's a bad thing. Like that's a bad thing.
That's an interesting. It's an interesting perspective about the hierarchy of churches. I find that quite fascinating, actually. And I think sometimes we forget the roots of some of the preferences and where they come from. That's quite intriguing.
Yeah, and so someone who does quite a lot with some work with Anglican churches. I mean, not as much as Selena, so I wouldn't claim to be an expert on Anglican social mores. But I think there are some people who will go to historic white churches because it's part of their heritage. And that's fine, because again, we have to understand that blackness and black experience is plural and it's complex.
Yeah.
That part of the danger sometimes is to fall into a kind of essentialized notion that all black folk are all the same. No, we have lots in common.
Yeah.
And we share a common heritage that makes us more alike than unalike. But that does not mean that we are all necessarily synonymous. And therefore, as Selina said quite rightly, there are styles of worship, there are different cultural mores in terms of how different churches work that suit different people. But also, there is that sense of still an internalized sense of oppression that comes out of colonialism. So in part of my work, I do a lot of work around post-colonialism. And post-colonial doesn't mean that colonialism is necessarily ended. It's ended in terms of political organization, but the internalization of some of those ideas that come out of that are things that still shape us. So I have friends who go to an Anglican church because they feel that that is part of their own class consciousness. Basically actually going to the established church that still has more privilege than any other church in Britain is for them a statement. And also, I think the final thing I want to say before I invite other people to talk is that, of course, it's also bear in mind that there's a lot of fluidity around church identity. So I have lots of friends who will go to a white majority church in the morning, but go to a Pentecostal church in the evening. And we'll switch. So part of going to a historic white church in the morning is part of their heritage. It's like I was born and brought up in this. I was christened into a Methodist or Baptist or Reformed or Catholic church. That's part of it's one part of my identity. And it's important to remind us that all of us have multiple identities.
Thank you so much.
We're never just one fixed thing. We are many things. So they go to a church in the morning for one thing, but they then go for a different type of spirituality in the evening for something else. So again, that also makes sort of counting sort of figures in terms of Black people's sort of denominational allegiances complicated because for many of us, we have multiple identities. So sometimes I go to a friend's Pentecostal church for all the things that David has said. It's about Black space, it's about, put it bluntly, it's about not having to see white people. You know, I'm being honest. It's just simply be able to sit down and say, you know, something. I spend most of my life having to skin teeth all the time and having to put a fixed face, and now I don't have to do it. I can just. But having said that, I know I could not do that every week. I could do it every week, but sometimes that's just what I need.
Well, the Black experience is multifaceted. It's almost, verging on potentially, and I know this might be a strong word, is verging on duplicitous, maybe even schizophrenic feeling at times, with the fact that we have different accents for different contexts. If you're in the barbershop, you speak one way. If you're at work, you speak another way. If you're at church, you speak another way. When you're in a family, you speak another way. And that's our experience generally. David, I wanted you to speak into this issue of the same question I asked Selina. And I'd like to hear your context again on the fact that there is a conversation happening, and we're talking about what people are talking about the fact that do some of these people who are in these spaces, like what we've just talked about with the Hillsong thing and happening around many other white-led Black majority churches, where Black people who have intentionally decided to, you can't choose who you fall in love with. You can't choose all the time where you work, but you can choose the space in which you worship. And these people have chosen to place their families, the Black people place their families, their young boys, their young children under white leadership, where once again, they see white in leadership, white pastors, white at the top, so to speak. And then they turn around and are complaining about the fact that this statement hasn't come out, their white leadership hasn't been vocalized. Should they lose the right to complain based on the fact that they've chosen to sit under these establishments anyway?
It's an interesting question. And let me just say something else, because Selina really got me thinking about millennials or anybody who comes from a Black church context and moves into a white church context and then comes back. But one of the things that struck me was the kind of almost the wizardry, the deceptiveness of what I will call the white offer. It's almost a repeat of Windrush, in a sense, where you leave where you are to go to where you want to get to, but when you get there, it's not what you left for. Right. And part of what we wrestle with as African Caribbean people is our own internalized pathology, our own sense of social dislocation. And these are some of the things that we're hearing. So these multiple identities that Professor Reddy was just talking about, sorry, could you like me? Anthony was just talking about. I'm just giving him his due because he's probably the most prolific black thinker, but one of the most prolific thinkers I know. So I tell him in public. So I've got no shame in telling. I'm in private. Got no shame in telling him in public that he's a genius in his thinking. But anyway, we have to wrestle with these things. So these multiple identities, they are part of who we are. Yeah. But they're part of who we are for a reason. Even the historical realities that we just heard outlined by Anthony Reddy are historical realities that emerge out of transatlantic slave trade. They emerge out of a particular cultural milieu, a particular historical context. And I think we have to take seriously those internalized pathologies that actually cause us to act in ways that are inconsistent with who we are, because we still continue to carry trauma. And I think sometimes, and I don't think it's happening there, but I think sometimes what whiteness does is it offers us an apparent sophistication that actually doesn't deal with the disease. So it's a complex set of medication that looks available, but actually when you take it, the disease doesn't get any better. And that's why the Black church is important, because it gives you the herbs then from the ground. It's the old bush stuff that your mama used to boil up and the veggies, and that heals you. And that's what happens in the Black church. So I think when you go into a white space like I did, but I made sure that when I went in there, I had power. And I was prepared to use that power, because it's a brutal space to exist in without power.
Wow.
Brutal space. Because what you have is cultural domination, numerical domination. You're numerically dominated. So you can have one of the things that you experience is that you make a contribution in a meeting. The agenda moves on. Then somebody rephrases it, a white person. And then they resubmit the very same thing that you said, and all of a sudden it's a genius idea.
Right.
And actually, that is quite a brutalizing experience. So I think that it's a brutal space to be in, if you choose to be in there. I think once you leave, and I think what we're beginning to hear, and it's likely that once you leave, you have to leave knowing that you're going into a deeply contested space, and that the sense of wholeness that would have been sought after in the Black space, that is now being looked for in the white space, is not going to be there.
Right.
And therefore, critiquing the Black space or what the white space doesn't give us leaves us in a very precarious position, leaves us in the middle ground. And so the person who journeys like I did, but I said I journeyed with power, and I know Selena's got a degree of power, a significant degree of power in what she does, and so does Anthony. But I think if you journey into that space and you find out when you get there that actually the person doesn't know who you are and doesn't value who you are and can't speak to who you are, then I don't think it's reasonable to turn back and critique the people who didn't know who you are, couldn't give you what you are, but didn't do it on the assumption of the fact that you're nearly not as human as they are. And I think that's important. So I think people have got the right to critique, but actually if you go on, it's like your parents say, don't touch the fire, don't touch the fire. You put your hand in the fire, you get burned, then you don't touch the fire again. But you can't critique the parent for saying don't touch the fire. And I just think, without being harsh, I just think that when we journey out, we need to know what we're leaving.
Yeah.
And having made the decision, we take responsibility for what we meet at the other end.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Selena. Go on.
I want to talk about this idea of intentional choosing, because we've said this a few times. People intentionally choosing to sit under white leaders to walk away from Black churches, and I don't feel like the process is that direct for lots of people. And I think that for some people also, there's this sense of calling. So I was on a Zoom call with lots of my friends who are Black in the Anglican church, And my heart's like heavy for them because they're suffering at every turn, from the stage of discerning whether they're called to ministry, to going through training, to now being in parishes. There's just stories of like angst for the whole journey. And I was asking them about, why are you still in this church when this is how you get treated all the time? And for them, there's a sense of God's called them to this church. And I can't tell them they're lying. I can't tell them they imagine the calling. They've gone through the journey of discernment. They've discerned the call of God. So it's not always a sense of they've intentionally decided they're done with the Black church. For some people, they've been very content in their very Black church, and they felt God calling them out against their own will. For a lot of them, they're not running there happily cheering to be in an hour and 15-minute service. They long to be there, and they felt God call them. And so I think there's an element of that in this as well that we have to take into consideration, which is why for me, as much as I see this suffering, that's why I feel like being a lecturer in a college like that, what keeps me there is knowing that these people are called here, sometimes against their will. And if I can ease that journey for them in the 2 or 3 years that they're training, then God give me the grace to do it. You know, I'm hoping the calling don't catch me and I end up having to like go through that process myself. But it's not always a sense of they've intentionally rejected the Black church. And many of them are still connected to their Black churches and are supported by them even while they're training.
See, Selena, I hear you. I have compassion on that, on that particular cohort or set of people. I'm not talking about those ones. I'm talking about anybody who chooses intentionally to leave the Black church, which they have a right to do. That's not my issue. But once an individual chooses to leave the Black space and go into a white space, I think they forego the right to critique at that point.
Yeah.
Because they've made the decision to leave. So the critique can't be a constructive one. It's only going to be a reflection of past experience, which by definition must be negative or not satisfying in order for the decision to be made to move on. And that's when I say, when you leave, it's like anything in life. If you make a decision in one direction, you can't blame the past or anything up until that point. You made the decision because you've exercised agency, not you. An individual's exercise agency. So I think I hear the distinction, and I won't speak to those people. I think those people who feel called, then it's our responsibility to journey with them. Because for a season, I felt called to that space, and I felt that despite the challenges, I was able to, because I felt called, I followed through on the call. But actually, because I felt called, I didn't then critique African and Caribbean spaces or Pentecostal spaces, because I knew that the call was only possible because of the formation that took place in those spaces.
Sometimes the call is also class. As Black people elevate in their economic status and their associations, they then choose to leave the Black spaces and go, and it kind of connects a little bit with what Anthony was saying about the social structures and the hierarchical structures of denominations and churches. Anthony, I don't know if you wanted to jump. Did you put your hand up just then to say something?
Yes, I did. Yeah, because I think, again, it's about being very sophisticated in our analysis. Because of course, like, there are different types of white-led churches, and so, for example, for me, I would differentiate. For example, someone might be Black and a Roman Catholic. Certainly, in terms of the last time the census was done, more Black people belonged to Roman Catholicism and then Anglo-Catholicism than any other tradition in Britain. So actually, the truth is that most Black folk, in terms of who were registering their identity on a census, were not necessarily saying that they were, for example, Pentecostals.
Yeah.
So again, if that is your historic roots, you might well go to a Black majority Pentecostal church for some of your time, but the notion that you would swap that entirely is not necessarily proved out by sort of church analysis. That said, I would then differentiate between someone who then goes to a white-led Pentecostal church as opposed to a Black-led Pentecostal church. I mean, it's still about choice, and so I wouldn't condemn them, but that's an entirely different set of movement than someone who says, well, actually, I've been part of this historic denomination for all of my life, and my historic roots of my family, like my own in terms of the Baptist church, that goes back centuries. those are different dynamics. And certainly I can think of one particular white-led Pentecostal church who shall remain nameless in Birmingham, but I think Selena might know where it is, in Solihull, with like a big sort of flashing cross on the front of it. I'm not going to name names, but if you live in Birmingham, you know where I'm talking. And the interesting thing about that church are the number of my black friends who have said to me, "Oh, Anthony, I'm not being reverse racist, but I think I've outgrown my Pentecostal church now. I've outgrown prophecy. I've outgrown UT because I now have an academic job, or I'm a professional, and I just sort of found this church. I found this church, it's too old-fashioned." And for me, again, on the one level, people met their choice, and that's fine. But what I find problematic about this is that those churches were the ones that enabled them actually to become middle class and professionals in the first place.
Right, absolutely.
At the minute they get to a certain level of success, now they're going to a white-led Pentecostal church because somehow they feel that church is more professional.
Yeah.
Now, as I said, this is complex and people have lots of reasons for doing so. But I would see that movement, for me, as being more problematic than someone who says, well, actually, I'm Anglican, I've been in the Anglican church all my life, I feel called to ministry in it. Yes, it's racist, but however, I believe that's where God wants me to be. Those are two entirely different sets of conversations, even though notionally, we're talking about people going from a black majority church to a white majority, white-led church, not necessarily white majority, a white-led church that has a black majority congregation. I mean, those are different dynamics.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Anthony. I want to move as we begin to close this out. Believe it or not, we've been talking for a couple of hours now, and I know I shouldn't do that as a host to let everybody know. If you've enjoyed it, we're going to go to our last topic, and then we're going to give just a few minutes for Q&A as well. So any questions you have, we obviously won't be able to take every question, but we'll try and get a few covered. And then maybe if you want, we might be able to do a part two if my friends are happy to come on. If you're happy to come on again, new friends and old friends, just give a thumbs up if you can. If you're happy, David, Selena, Bishop, Anthony, if you're happy to come on again, thank you. If you've enjoyed this, guys, all our auditors, all of our eavesdroppers, just give once again another 300 fire emojis before we move on. But I want to move the conversation because the situation we're seeing happening in America and also happening over here, beginning to happen over here in terms of this topic of protest. Bishop, I'm going to come to you first. I want to hear your perspective on what the Christian should do in terms of, we're talking about justice, race, religion in the 21st century. What does protest look like to a Christian? Should we protest, or should we step forward in aggressive protest, or should we step back in peace? Let me stoke the fire a little bit by throwing some potential theological perspective on it as well from my view. I mean, let's not forget that Jesus told us to be two things. Jesus told us to be harmless as doves, but he told us to be wise as serpents. Jesus also made a whip. And the Bible's very definitive about the fact that he was an artisan weapon maker in a moment of rage, where there were the poor being abused, the less fortunate being treated terribly by those money changers in the temple. And Jesus turned over tables. Jesus whipped everybody. Well, he made a whip at the very least. We know theologically, historically, from my analysis, and I've always loved temple studies, the fact that the temple had their own guard, their own police force, and yet that police force, nowhere in the Mark does it mention that the police force came and arrested Jesus for turning over temples in protest. And so I'd throw that into the mix. I know I shouldn't do that as a host. I shouldn't have thrown my little perspective in. But if I could hear from you on your perspective of protest, or should we step back in peace, especially looking at the racial injustices that have continued over and over again. And now we're seeing, of course, this reaction happening in America and leaking into places like the UK. Go ahead, Bishop.
In January, I was in the Holy Land as part of something called the Holy Land Coordination. And we had to queue up one day to get through the separation barrier that separates Israel from Palestine. And one of the graffiti, which I had to stare at for 10 minutes before we were let through the barrier, was silence is the politics of consent. And this spoke very prophetically and powerfully to me about the right to protest, the right to have your voice, and the confidence to speak out when one needs to denounce injustice. Now, protest and violence then has to be looked at together. And I do not condemn anger and rage. And the consequences of anger and rage are, of course, conflict and ultimately violence. But it's not the anger and rage that one needs to condemn, because what is lying behind it? Injustice, oppression. When we were talking about multiple identities, we live in a world of multiple identities, and whatever space we occupy, we will always be people of multiple identities, because that is the world in which we now live. And I think it's true when we try to hold together things like protest and peace and violence, that there is a right place for all these things.
Thank you so much, Bishop. Selena, then David, then Anthony, and then we'll wrap up for our conversation and just open for a couple of questions to come in. But we're going to have to do a part 2. Go ahead, Selena. Your statement on protest, forward in protest, aggressive protest, or backward in the name of what they call peace.
I mean, I'm definitely all for the protests. I'm more for organizing and deciding what our interests are and what our asks are. So before I was a theologian, I was a community organizer, and our task was always to organize, to build strong relationships, to build power at the grassroots, to know what our interests are, to analyze power, to know who to go after. And I think that's what I think is probably missing from some of our protesting, is what is it that we want and what are we asking for? Who do we need to give us what we want? You know, is it that we want inquiries into deaths in custody in the UK? Is it that we're talking about very specific reparations to particular organizations or causes? I think the task of organizing what it is that we are needing and finding the resources for that is crucial. So I think that's really the path towards creating the better world that we want. It's being organized. I think protests are great. They draw the attention, but we need to have a strategy beyond that.
Thank you for being so succinct and insightful. I appreciate that, especially with the mindset of somebody who's got a background in community organizing. We'll go to Anthony, and then we'll finish with David. Go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, I think protesting is intrinsic to the very nature of being a Christian. It's certainly very intrinsic to the very sense of being a Protestant. It's important to remember that actually that one of the derivations of the word Protestant is to protest. I mean, that's what Luther was doing.
Yeah.
And so therefore, to protest against injustice is the very heart of what our gospel is. And so much of what Jesus is doing in partnership with his early followers is a resistance against Roman imperialism. It's a resistance against empire. And that fight that he has at the time is still the one we have now. And I think what we have to accept is that people who are in intense and acute pain will respond viscerally and not rationally. And therefore, part of what we see now in terms of this outflowing of anger is, I think, a generation of people are saying enough is enough. And therefore, certainly when I've done a few brief media interviews and they've tried to get me to talk about condemning the looters, I have refused to do that, not because I condone what they're doing, but because that is to miss the point. The point is that when someone is murdered in front of our eyes, and it takes them days just to decide what we can see in front of us, that this is This is state-sponsored murder.
Yeah.
So when that happens, and when you see that playing by the rules is not getting us anywhere, even though I still, and I certainly agree with Selena that what we need in cooler, rational times is that ability to stand back, to strategize, and to find constructive ways of engagement in order to get what we want. But I think sometimes we simply have to acknowledge that in the midst of sheer anger and frustration, things will boil over, and that's what we're seeing at this moment in time. That what we are seeing is the emboldened white supremacy. Now, to be very clear, America is built on white supremacy. It is built on the basic construction of its whole identity as a republic is founded on black suffering and black exploitation. That is the very nature of what it is to be America. Unless we get too smug in this country, the truth is we taught them all the bad habits that they learned in the first place. All the bad habits come from Britain. And actually, one of the things that we need to wrestle with as Christians is that when we read the scriptures and we identify Jesus against empire, is the fact that we, as Britain, are empire. We're not Jesus. We are the Romans.
Yeah.
Therefore, part of our own complicity is that the church has to recognize, certainly I think all churches, but I've got to say this to the bishop in terms of being the Church of England, and certainly please do read my book, Theologizing Brexit, where I show that actually the growth of mission Christianity becomes one of the means by which white exceptionalism and empire is created that then exploits black bodies. And so therefore, we have to resist and we have to protest and we have to acknowledge that this is a long fight, because what we are fighting is a systemic construction of Western imperialism that has been in the making for several hundred years and is founded on black suffering and the persecution of black bodies.
So insightful. Thank you so much, Anthony. I'm going to exercise host privilege, and we're going to collect all the questions, guys, and we're going to have to do a part 2. I'm going to try and see if we can collect, I should say, our guests' diary entries and try and get something done. We've been online for a long time tonight, and we could talk probably for another 2 to 3 hours. This is a necessary, valuable, healthy conversation, open and frank. And we're going to collect the questions that have come in and we'll try and address those. We'll give most of the time next time to the questions. But as we could finish off, I'm going to give David the closing statement. Dave, we want to hear your perspective on that same context of protest versus peace. And then we'll shut it down for tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think we often think about our own protests, but I was involved in a meeting with some leaders, with some government officials around what they call the race disparity audit. And it shows that in every area of British life, these are government statistics. It was commissioned by Theresa May. In every area of British life, there is black people suffer disproportionately, not just black people, BAME communities.
Right.
And I want to suggest that actually we live in a context and we live in a culture of protest. Yeah. There is a consistent protest against our presence.
Yeah.
Anthony talked about resistance, and I think that's important. And Anthony also raised the issue of looting in terms of the riot. And, again, this is, Bishop earlier talked about holding the mirror up to ourselves. So, if you ever talk about a riot, they talk about a riot, that you talk about a riot in America, then they say there's going to, if a riot happens there, they start talking about the riots in Brixton, the riots in Tottenham, the riots in Notting Hill. And they start, so they bring a historical perspective to rioting, which often ends in looting. And actually, the critique of the riot is not necessarily that the riot happens on its own, but that there's looting.
Right.
And yet, in America, Anthony talked about Britain teaching America everything that it learned. Historically, this country has been a country of looters. It's looted Africa, looted parts of India, Pakistan. It was an empire. It was a looting machine. In America, they dispossessed the land from the first people. I don't know how the first people can be last, but that's what they've done. And that was through looting.
Yes.
Same is true with the Aborigines in Australia. And the same is true with the Maoris in New Zealand. So if we're going to talk about rioting and looting, let's do it within the historical context, in the same way that happens with our community, that when people riot, you start talking about Brixton, you start talking about Notting Hill, you start talking about Croydon in 2010. Let's let both sides have a historical dialogue about rioting and about protest. Because I think that when we are being consistently attacked and dehumanized, either in word or in action, then we have a moral obligation to protest. That actually if we don't protest, is complicity and collusion with the very system that's trying to undermine us. I began to think about this theologically. So the other day, Anthony was kind enough to receive a call from me. And I was exploring the notion of, I said to him, I'm thinking whether violence is legitimate. Because I'm not advocating it, but I'm saying I'm thinking it was always peace. Martin Luther King had a dream, peace. And then we're still getting somebody killed years later. Martin Luther King's a hero, Malcolm X is a demon. And he was, I know his position changed, but I said to Anthony, could you help me think through this thing? Is it, I'm beginning to rethink my position on violence, and I couldn't work it out. And he said to me, David, the West has already done it. There's a theology of peace, peaceful protest. But actually, if you do, apparently, if you violate a human right, if you commit a human rights violation, then actually, he kindly said to me, they've come up with the theory of the just war. So here are 4 reasons where your protest doesn't need to be peaceful anymore, that it can be violent. Now, just imagine if the masses took that on board and said, actually, we're going to reappropriate the 4 principles of the just war and make them relevant to our existential experience as Black people, or as working class white people, or as First Nation people in America, or Maoris. Now, I'm not advocating violence. I'm just saying, actually, when we start to talk about protest, what we're actually talking about is what people perceive or assume that we're entitled to based on the assumption of our inferiority. Yeah. So we don't deserve what we're protesting for. So how the hell do you protest? Because when everyone else protests, it's okay.
Well, I want to thank you all for tonight. Thank you, David, for that last donation to the conversation. I've wanted to always give this platform that God's allowed me to have a little influence to quality, healthy moments, information, conversation that hopefully brings transformation to life. I think we began on a good footing here. We've had healthy, open dialogue. We've been transparent. We've been real. We've covered a lot of different issues, but I want part 2 to now talk about practical steps forward, how we can try and really make this thing happen in terms of justice, in terms of unity. And so that's what we really want to cover next time, and also deal with all the questions. I'm humbled to have been able to have you all on tonight. Thank you so much. Selena, you've been a great guest tonight. Bishop, most grateful to you for your time. Anthony, thank you so much. I'm gonna dare to say Professor Anthony, thank you so much. And David, you know, we love you to pieces. Thank you. And we're grateful for Steve coming on and being transparent about the mistakes he's made and bringing his context to this conversation as well. I want to invite everybody to the Tab London online. We call it Tab at Home. You can go straight to YouTube and watch other Wednesday night live conversations that we've had as well about other topics as well, which will be hopefully insightful, some good adult conversation that will hopefully again produce some revelation and insights for you guys. That's on the Tab London YouTube channel, And we're hoping by God's grace, if the Lord allows, we'll be able to do a part 2 to this next week. But thank you. If you've enjoyed it, let all the guests know by releasing, let's go for 300 fire emojis from everybody as a form of round of applause. Seeing as we can't hear you, you wonderful people who have stayed with us tonight for this couple of hours. If you've been blessed by it, if it's been insightful and helpful, please let our guests know. Get Professor Reddy's books. You can go online and get hold of his books and his stuff, and you will be mind blown by his perspicacity and his erudition in this particular field. And we hopefully will be able to empower one another with more information. God bless you all. And remember, send any questions into Mike White London into our inbox, and our team will try and collate as many as possible, getting ready, hopefully, for part 2 next week. I love you guys. I love my Tab Church family. I miss seeing your faces. I miss being able to hug you. Pastor Donna Maria misses you as well. Those of you from our church, and if you're a friend of the Tab Church as well, thank you so much for your support. We value it greatly, and we're humbled that you'd even tune into our services and to come on board tonight to be part of this conversation. Thank you all. Have a great evening. Heaven smile on you. And we pray for the family of George Floyd. We pray for all who have encountered great suffering in this recent season, especially, that has given, it's sad that their sacrifice has actually opened up opportunities for conversation and dialogue that had been crushed before. And so somehow I pray in some small way that their deaths have not been in vain, and that we use this moment to bring real change. And we pray for peace, and we pray for the future to be brighter than the past has ever seen. God bless you all. Have a great evening. Thank you, Bishop. Thank you, Selena. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, David. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. God bless you. Heaven smile on you.